us today. This is the Uncomfortable Conversations workshop through the Reimagine platform. And we are going to start off with introductions from presenters here in a moment. Before we do, just as people are coming in, just want to do some basic housekeeping with everyone. For those that are comfortable with it, we would encourage you to keep your video on during our 90 minutes together. Being able to see others here provides us with a sense of community, knowing that we're all here and in this together. So if you're comfortable with that, we would love to see you. We're going to ask that everybody stay muted for the workshop. So if you notice, looks like everyone is muted right now. If you notice you're not, the mute button should be down the lower left-hand corner. We are recording this offering. So if you want to change your name to just a first name, if that matters to you, now would be the time to do that. And you can do that in the profile section of your Zoom account. I know that a lot of people have been doing Zoom for months and months now, so you're probably very aware of the Zoom platform. But just so you know, in the upper right-hand corner, you have two different screen views that you can choose from, either the speaker or the gallery view. The speaker view means that you can see the person who is speaking primarily. They show up larger on your screen. And the gallery view means that everyone can kind of see each other equally. So whatever feels better to you there. We also might be putting some links in the chat box. So you should see a chat icon in the lower part of your screen. And when that's clicked, the chat box will open up to the right side of your screen there. Please also feel free to use the chat box just to type in any questions that might come up for you during the workshop. We'll attempt to get to some of the questions towards the end. And if we do kind of run close there, we'll definitely take a scan of those questions and send a follow-up email to all of the participants that are here with us today. You should have been emailed an attachment which provided notes for the workshop. So as we are speaking, you can definitely follow, yes, Mary's holding them up there. You can follow along with those notes. If you printed it out, great space to write down your own notes, anything that comes up for you. Part of our rationale around sharing this notes ahead of time is that we are talking about very deep and sensitive material here. And we didn't really want a slide deck to be standing in between us and the community as we're gathered here today. So we just wanted you to have those on hand, especially for people here that might be a little bit more of a visual learner. And finally, we just wanted to thank Reimagine for the opportunity to present here and be with you all today. There's been so many wonderful offerings since the start of the Worldwide Virtual Festival. One of the benefits of a pandemic is the offering here through the Reimagine platform. I've participated in a lot of them, and so I'm really grateful to be here as a contributor with Sarah and Dean today. So this workshop is a collaborative endeavor between Sarah Peterson from Mourning organization, myself, I'm Elizabeth Johnson from the Peaceful Presence Project, and we also have Dean Sharp here, who's going to co-facilitate some really essential pieces of the offering. So we're going to open up with just a brief presenter overview for the three of us. So as I said, my name is Elizabeth Johnson, and I currently work as the executive director for a Central Oregon-based nonprofit called the Peaceful Presence Project. I'm here in Bend, Oregon, with Dean and Sarah. And our mission with the Peaceful Presence is to help people live well, age well, and die well by reimagining the way that they talk about, plan for, and experience the last stage of life. There are currently 6 individuals involved with the organization. We're all end-of-life doulas, and we provide non-medical, thoughtful support to individuals and families in the area by encouraging discussion around death and the dying process, by facilitating plans for the last stage of life through a variety of different modalities, and by offering compassionate presence at the bedside for individuals and for families during those last months and days and weeks of life. And we're structured as a nonprofit. We really want to make our services available to anyone that identifies a need for them. I also work as a sorrow or grief companion for people as a side practice. And from a personal side of things, my son died, it was almost 10 years ago, shortly after birth. And that experience, amongst others, really informed a lot of my personal relationship and deep dive with the grieving process and discomfort in general. And I'm really grateful to be with all of you here today. So I think I'll turn it over to Dean, if you would mind providing an introduction to this group, Dean.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm Dean Sharp, and my training was initially and practice was as a general surgeon, and worked here in Bend for about 20 years doing that. And I also worked for a chunk of that time as a hospital administrator. So I shared jobs as a surgeon, and also worked as the vice president of medical affairs at the local hospital system. And after I retired, I started to facilitate seminars with the Sacred Art of Living Center here in Bend, and for the last 11 years have facilitated those seminars around the country, and actually overseas in Ireland and in Canada. And those units are about facing into spiritual pain, and particularly the things that show up at the end of life. And in addition to that, I lecture to the nursing class here on compassion fatigue in Bend, and I'm really happy to be here. Probably the most important thing is that I have 3 grandsons, and the rest of that information is pretty non-essential. So, Sarah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sarah Peterson, and I am a licensed clinical social worker here in Oregon with many years of experience with hospice patients as a social worker, and then personally suffered the loss of a child and a parent in a very short time, and transformed my path, obviously. And so now I have a private practice, specializing with folks who are dealing with grief or just major life transitions. And then I also am the executive director of Clear Mourning. And Clear Mourning is really designed to shift the culture of grief. So it's very aligned with what we're doing here today in providing some tools and access points to shifting how we deal with our discomfort. I'm just really eager to share with you, and very grateful for your time and energy right now.
So thanks. So I'll get started with the content, unless there's something else Elizabeth or Sarah wanted to say. Great. So in your handout, we'll start with the sheet that has the triangle on it, which is labeled the total pain model. Total pain model actually was developed by Dame Cicely Saunders, who is the birth mother of the modern hospice movement. And she felt very strongly that pain, the total pain of anybody, and her interest was those people at the end of life specifically, but I'm here to tell you that that applies to anyone who's in a hospital bed, or ill, and I would broaden that to include anybody on the planet. So the pain or the suffering that any one of us is undergoing at any particular time in our lives is really refracted through kind of 4 prisms. There's a physical dimension for pain. It's kind of the obvious one. You hit your finger with a hammer, it hurts, you're hardwired for that, and it's that physical dimension of pain. It's very biologic. And the second prism is the emotional dimension. Clearly, the emotional dimension can be initiated or stimulated or created by pain in any of the other three prisms. For example, if you do hit your finger with the thumb, almost with a hammer, I should say, almost immediately, you know, with the physical pain comes, you know, perhaps the anger of having done such a boneheaded thing, or whatever other, you know, sadness and wondering and concern, you know, about the hurt finger. So there's an emotional dimension. There's a social dimension that has to do with our relationship with others and our relationship with systems in which we function. If you hit your finger hard enough and yell loudly enough, in my case, I might be concerned that my grandchildren heard that expletive, or I might become concerned about the emergency room visit I might have to make. And, you know, is that going to be safe in this day and age with COVID around? And what happens if I did break my finger? And I wonder if insurance will cover this. And so there's a whole social dimension of you know, this total pain that might occur. And then there's a spiritual dimension. And Cecily Saunders felt that the spiritual dimension was the most overlooked. It was the least understood. It was the one that she focused on, and she felt, certainly at the end of life, that once physical pain had been dealt with in patients, that the most significant thing that showed up was this dimension of spiritual pain. And at its most basic level, spiritual pain could be defined as those times when we're in resistance to the way things are. You know, in the case, for example, where I might be dying or someone that I love is dying, it's that dimension of pain that has to do with, you know, this was not my plan. This is not how I foresaw it would happen. This is me standing in the river of the universe itself, resisting where it's going and saying it's not fair, and attaching any number of points of meaning to what's going on. And so what we have is these four dimensions which occur and which are present and which interact with one another. So there's no question that if I tell myself a story about how the universe is unfair when I slam my thumb with a hammer, then I might well get upset emotionally. I have the physical dimension and pain, and I've already talked about the social dimension. The genius of Cecily Saunders wasn't so much this, because I really think that most of us have an intuitive understanding of this. Her genius was that the pain of any caregiver, or really anyone in relationship to the person who we're talking about their total pain, that the pain of the caregiver or the person in relationship with that person contributes to the total pain of the patient or the friend or the relative who is undergoing something which is causing for them some suffering. That our suffering isn't separate from one another. Our suffering is interdependent upon one another, and that those we are in relationship with, whether that be professionally, as in the case of a professional caregiver, or simply as friends or family, that the stuff that's up for me while I'm trying to spend time supporting or being with someone in their pain will either contribute to or not contribute to their total pain. What that implies is that it is the responsibility of all of us to be as clean as possible and to understand those things which have hurt us. So a story which comes to mind whenever I teach this section is I have a daughter who is now in her mid-30s almost, who has had probably about 35 surgical procedures in her life starting when she was 2. She has a chronic problem where she doesn't handle cerebral spinal fluid in her brain appropriately, and so she needs it to be drained surgically. And in 2008 was the last major series of surgeries she had. She had 5 that summer. And toward the end of a long summer, she came home having had everything we thought fixed, and her headaches got progressively worse and worse and worse, and she didn't really tell us much about it. She just treated herself and kind of tried to ignore them until finally she seized at home. And that necessitated a race to the emergency room, a helicopter ride over the mountains to OHSU and their neurosurgical intensive care unit. And my wife, who always gets to ride the helicopter, for some reason went off with Annalisa, and I drove home, packed up what I thought we might need for who knows how long, and then chased the helicopter over the mountains in the car. Arrived that afternoon at the intensive care unit, and Annalisa was really in agony. She had a headache to end all headaches, and in addition to her headache itself, she had horrible muscle spasms, so that we'd lean over her and rub her back on either side in the middle of her back in an attempt to relieve anything we could. And she'd writhe up and grab the front of our shirts and just be in agony. And they came in and treated her with medications and left, and basically nothing touched her pain. And that went on that afternoon and all night and the following day and all the following night. And we were waiting for tests and whatever, and we're kind of in a holding pattern. And you know how intensive care units are. One of us would never leave her bedside, but there was not even a chair in this ICU room. So we'd put a bath blanket on the floor, and one of us would lie on the floor in the night as much as we could. The other was out in the hall on a couch. You know how that is. There's always the waiting rooms in hospitals. And so one of us sleeping on the couch, we ran shifts. No one got any sleep. And on that second morning, after 2 nights of this, in walked a nurse named Karen, who we hadn't seen ever before. And she walked in and she said, "I can't fix the problem." This was this is something we're going to talk about, but she recognized there was nothing she could do to make it go away. She couldn't fix what was going on. But she said, "We're going to do something to try to get on top of your pain today, because that's something maybe we can do something about." And so she walked to Annalisa's bedside and reached for her arm, which was her arm with her IV in it. And Annalisa pulled back because, as you can imagine, after 30 plus surgery, she's got no veins in any arm. And to get an IV started in her is a big deal. And she just really has no interest in people mucking with it who shouldn't be, or that she doesn't know what's going on. And the nurse, Karen, said, "What?" And she said, I just don't want you to muck with my IV unless I really know what you're doing." And Karen looked her in the eyes, and she said, I wasn't going to do anything with your IV. I was just going to hold your hand and get to know you." This was profoundly different. And so she said, "Do you have a place in nature you like to go to?" And Annalisa said, "Well, I love the beach." And Karen said, well, what kind of a beach do you love? I mean, there's the Oregon coast, and then there's, Bali. And Annalisa said, I really liked Hawaii because we used to go there when I was a kid. And I really liked this one beach that we spent a lot of time on. And it wasn't on the ocean, it was on a bay. So the waves were small and they kind of lapped. And Karen really asked her a bunch of questions about the trade winds and how it felt on her skin and what the sand felt like. And Annalisa said, the trades are always blowing and rustling in the palm trees, and I can just hear it. And the sand is warm under my feet. When I lay on it, it's soft, and the breeze caresses me, and it's so warm and perfect. And so once Karen had her truly understanding and holding the vision of this place in nature she loved, she said, okay, now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you your pain medication, and I'm going to give it to you as a pretty fast bolus. And you're going to feel it go in, because I'm going to open up your IV, and it's going to hit you. And when it does, I want you to let go and flow with it. And what I really want you to do is to go to your beach in Hawaii. Do you think you can do that? And Annalisa looked at her and said, well, I can try. And so Karen administered the same drug she had been getting for 2.5 days. Annalisa took a deep breath and fell asleep for the first time. And so the key here is that the way in which care is given makes all the difference, and that you can administer a drug as just a medication. Oh, here's your pill, here's your drug, wham it in and leave. Or you can administer your words or your medication or whatever, or your healing presence as a sacrament instead. I think it makes a difference whether you just do it as a rote thing or whether you do it as a sacrament. And what I know is that it made a huge difference to Annalisa in that moment, in that she found the first relief that she'd found in a while. Now, I think the other thing that you really need to be aware of is that any nurse walking into that room in that ICU had to be not a great experience. 2 doctors, general surgeon, my wife's an obstetrician gynecologist, taking care of their daughter who'd been sick and in the hospital many, many times at the end of a summer of complicated surgeries and complications back at the same place again, with an inability to fix the situation. Any nurse walking in there was walking into a hard place to be, hard conversations to have, tough situation to be with. And to the extent that they were uncomfortable, contributed to Annalisa's total pain, because their inability to connect with her, to connect with the total suffering she had, in addition to just the physical suffering, made it so that it didn't help her, and probably actually contributed to her overall suffering, in that she felt not seen, not heard, not understood. And when Karen walked in and simply connected with her, she felt seen and understood. And it touched her on all 4 dimensions rather than just the one. So, thank you. I think that sort of gives us a context in which now to begin to hold where we're going to journey from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Dean, for the context and the personal story. So as we begin to understand where we show up in the face of discomfort, I'll share my screen here, and we have a narrative exercise, quick little example for you to see your self-assessment. Where do you fall in the spectrum of discomfort? Are you doing okay with it? Do you run away from it? Do you freeze up? And from this information, I think it would be interesting to use that filter through the rest of this conversation as you try to further understand what the tools that we're sharing with you might look like for you, and just to reassess how your discomfort shows up. So I'm sitting with a group of people with whom I'm familiar. They start to share information and I feel the opinion form in my mind. The person next to me asks what I think. Do you, when you're asked about your opinion, usually feel nervous, eager and excited, or maybe you just generally stay quiet? If you interviewed those who know you best, you could expect them to say that you share your views, that you agree with them, or that you stay quiet. And this is a complicated one because people generally, I find, either are really good at asking for help or they're really sort of terrible at it. And I think that's a really interesting measurement to operate from, because asking for help can be uncomfortable. So, you know, if you were there on a Sunday afternoon and you realized you needed help with something and you're starting to get ready to make the call, do you feel like, no problem? Do you think I'm such a problem? Or will you do whatever it takes to avoid asking for the help at all? And so just consider these questions and, you know, like I said, use them as a foundation from which we'll just keep exploring. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Sarah. So if people are moved, maybe just take 20 or 30 seconds sitting with these questions just to jot down any sort of responses or anything that comes up to your mind or your body as you sort of feel into these three scenarios. You know, any sort of impressions or a note of trending wise, you know, if you always go sort of to the nervous side or the pull back and not sure opinion wise. So maybe just another 20 seconds, anything you want to write down that's come up for you. Great, and you can continue to hold this, but maybe also sort of bookmark that awareness or any personal insights that have started to bubble up from these prompts. And what I want to do now is just provide us with a more expansive vantage point from which we might be able to delve into one of our main focal points for today, which is the question of how did we get here? Why is it that we are generally fairly unskilled or unpracticed when it comes to just sitting close to uncomfortable topics or maybe engaging in uncomfortable conversations associated with death, grief, you know, and I think that can extend to conversations around social injustice, racial inequality, planetary pain. And you'll find that we're using the experience of our experience with or relationship to grief as a means of distilling or digesting our general relationship to discomfort in the world. And we find that our ability to grieve or not grieve is oftentimes a really good indicator of how we do with discomfort in general. Susan David, a psychologist from the Harvard Medical School, points out in her work that our cultural dialogue at its core is radically avoidant, very avoidant. And as we begin to unravel the shared language that we use around things like death and grief and loss, we see that this avoidance really touches and permeates into so many areas of our life, whether it's how we approach uncomfortable conversations that might be more personal in nature, or whether we're looking at spaces of civic dialogue. And this plays out for us in so many ways as a culture. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just pulling this apart a bit. Obviously, there's a lot more to say than what I can share here in our short amount of time together. And what I say here is by no means exhaustive. And Sarah, if you want to maybe pull up that next screen, we were hoping that people would have access to this ahead of time, so we didn't do screen share, but it seems like some people are needing a little bit of, maybe didn't get the email. So we'll do this screen share here off and on for all of you. So one thing to note is as a culture, couched in our language is really this inherent distancing from or defense against anything that's not comfortable, anything that feels a little bit demanding. And as an example of this, when we look at the language that we use surrounding discomfort or pain, we can often hear ourselves saying things like, I'm coping. I just need to learn how to cope with this. If only they knew how to cope. And interestingly, the word cope actually is rooted in or a derivative of the word coup, which means to strike. So what we witness here is that, built into our language is this understanding that in a lot of ways, we need to go to battle or war with things like death and grieving and being uncomfortable. And if you just feel into how that kind of plays out into the body, we have the stance of defiance or, almost pushing back, sort of hands and fist raised, this act of triumphing over the uncomfortable. And as we are all aware, language creates reality. So when we pause and watch the way we consciously or unconsciously speak about discomfort, we begin to see so much of our language as really perpetuates an attempt to stay above or distance from that which we deem uncomfortable. Our culture also, as I'm sure we can all attest, sees grief and death and discomfort as oftentimes being really messy or grim. These are things in our mind that, oftentimes need to be cleaned up or altered or fixed. And we are so embedded in this mastery orientation to the world. We regard ourselves as people who can solve problems. And so most, where that goes is most everything has an answer. There's a loophole for everything, a way out. And one of the byproducts of this is that we can tend to look at life as a potential problem that can use our solving. It's life could be a challenge to be surmounted. And then there's another angle that we often take around this. Resma Menakem, who is a trauma specialist with a focus on racialized trauma as it's experienced somatically through the body, he talks about a concept called premature consolation, where we strive to make everything just fine, okay, before we actually have done the work to really, before we've asked ourselves to really grapple with difficult situations. And I think we really can see how this attitude or this mindset plays out for us in so many territories of our life. And on top of that, we have the additional pressure of doing things as perfectly or cleanly as possible. And this really has a deep impact on our collective psyche. We also, I think it's important to note, have this real cultural focus or preference for the sensation of ascendance versus descendance. And Francis Weller, a well-respected psychotherapist and author who works a lot with people in the grieving process, he says that we are very fearful of this downward movement. We like the feeling of being in the light, of levity, of being near with happiness. And our individual and our collective value often sources from the ability to, pull up your bootstraps, to push through, to reestablish the sense of productivity and all rightness. So a lot of times people who are suffering or grieving, are really met with this intolerance or frustration because they are not mirroring that cultural narrative that says, we value you when you show us that you can overcome adversity, when you are strong and okay. So there's this collective sense that, going towards grief or the uncomfortable will only make us more powerless or static or incapable. Megan Devine has written a book called It's Okay That You Are Not Okay. And she highlights that as a society, we have a really hard time reconciling the fact that there are some pains in life that never get redeemed. There are some things where there never really is an outcome. And that part of the challenge in that is that to learn how to lean into and live with something. So the myth we've been sold in so many ways is everything needs to work out in the end, preferably sooner than later, and that's what it should look like. So because of this, I think we often don't talk about grief and death and suffering in a true way. We're sort of stuck in this territory of denial and distortion. And those that are grieving or sitting with discomfort, often feel apart from or misunderstood or asked to be anywhere else other than where they are in that moment. And whereas grief and suffering really are meant to be shared and held and acknowledged, to the core, we are social beings. We have this deep reliance on one another. The majority of people are really asked, I think we find, to go to these spaces in a very solitary manner. So in some insidious way, we've kind of privatized the experience of grief and discomfort. So the next slide here shows, in our discomfort, the consequence of this is that we either intentionally or maybe unintentionally, through a lack of awareness or practice, we can tend to make people go at it alone. Like I said, we force them into the solitary place with their discomfort and their grief. We dismiss or undermine others' experiences because of our own discomfort with discomfort. We do all that we can to bypass our own suffering because we haven't built up the tools and the practice to really be there in the midst of that. We can put pressure on ourselves to make things better, to say the right thing, to find the magic fix. And we really fail to listen to others' stories, what is happening for them, because we hyper focus on them feeling better. That's what we want from them. So what this reveals to us is that, in a lot of ways, we are anything but present. We aren't in the what is, and we don't build up the tools to sit with and be with and actually be changed, internally by uncomfortable spaces. And because we don't talk about grief in our culture, we have these, sort of overflowing or untended, I think you could call them stockpiles of grief that we never really speak about. The more they grow, the more difficult it is to even look in the direction of this grief. And I think in these times of pandemic or, massive kind of global strife, we all really can tap into those stockpiles of grief or really feel that. So we walk around in this really grief illiterate, pain avoidant world. And the consequence of this is that we don't know how to show up for ourselves, and we oftentimes don't know how to show up for others. Grief and pain and discord and death exist, but when we meet them, we're sort of this jumbled mess of, it shouldn't be this way, and I don't have the tools to even be here. I don't have the language to speak about your pain or mine. Do I have the option to opt out? Do I even want to know or hear that which is before me? And Joanna Macy, I'm sure a lot of you on this call have probably heard of her. She's an amazing author, teacher, activist. She says that unacknowledged pain and grief result in disconnection and burnout and a damaging lack of empathy for others. So I would argue, I think our current sort of human mandate, or the opening that we have, is to begin to really exercise our compassion and our vulnerability muscles and really start doing truth-telling about pain and grief and love and loss and death. And we really, I think, need to find ways to share in and be moved by the experience of loss and pain in our own lives and in the larger world. And a huge first step is really recognizing the difference between solving pain and tending to pain, being with pain. And being able to do this helps us to be more human. I think in a lot of ways it's a matter of working on our distress tolerance. To Dean's story earlier, how do we be with ourselves with another's pain? And it really takes contemplation and practice. So one of our intentions today is to really share some tools with all of you around this, because what it does come down to is presence, being with what is, and this is one of the primary skills. So I want to do a little bit of a gear change here, but bring forward all of this content into the next section of our offering. And in our workshop overview, we stated that one of our points of focus would be on the discomfort experienced before, during, and after death, including what the grieving process looks like. So I'm going to focus a bit on the death, on the before death space, and then Sarah will delve into the after death experience as it relates to our uncomfortability and grief. So what I want to highlight is that our ability to be present to these spaces of fragility, of vulnerability, of loss, of massive change is really informed and impacted by all that I just reflected upon. And when we are dealing with loss, with endings, with death, a lot is asked of us in these spaces. These can be really uncomfortable, inherently uncomfortable territories. And these experiences can be dotted with so many pain points for us and so many, emotional landmines. The denial, as I have here in the screen, the denial instinct can really flare up. That sense of, I don't want it to be this way. I don't want you to die. I don't want to die. Maybe this is not really happening. It won't happen. The shared history piece can feel really intense and weighty. These questions of what have we been through in this life? What has been left unsaid? Can we find a place of connection in the midst of the pain? Can we even talk about the pain? And then, it's a space where regret can really flourish. These feelings of, I didn't do enough. You didn't do enough. I should have done this earlier. I should have said this. I shouldn't have been so afraid, ... So I want us just to pause again and maybe pull back just a bit, get settled into your body, and think through times in your life when something was ending. Maybe it was someone you loved was nearing death. Maybe you received news of some sort of a terminal diagnosis. There could be people here with us today that haven't experienced a death, or haven't been sort of near that death space. So in that case, maybe think through an experience that where something was ending, and that it had a real emotional intensity to it. Maybe it was a relationship ending or something in life coming to a close. And just spend some time, rooting into your body. And then, as we did in the earlier exercise, begin just to reflect upon that question of, what did you do? What did you feel in this space? And in your mind's eye, in your body, just begin to feel into whether there was some sort of instinct to maybe fight. Maybe there was a lot of an anger that emerged, the sense of it shouldn't be this way. Or maybe there was an instinct to flee, this massive sense of overwhelm, of needing to get away from what was before you. Or maybe there was a sense of being paralyzed, by the awareness of this major change of loss. Maybe you froze or numbed out. And maybe, just maybe you were able to face that which was before you, and that you found some place of steadiness or presence as you confronted this loss. And as we begin to cultivate, this level of self-awareness, we can oftentimes start to see trends in terms of how we respond to or how we react to uncomfortable spaces. And I know for me, I have a tendency to want to flee, this attempt to outrun that which is out of my control, like death. So, as we kind of just go through the rest of the time with one another today, just spend some time, kind of paying attention to, if you note for yourself, some sort of consistency around this. The point being, death, impending death, the knowledge of death, unanticipated death, can bring a massive intensity to our lives. because we generally, avoid discomfort, this window can be one of really great pain for us. Oftentimes because it kind of encompasses all that has been unsaid or untouched. And typically in these spaces, without practice, we deal with pain around forgiveness or unfinished business. Maybe we find that we just have not been having the candid conversations that we wanted to have most of our lives. So we're a bit unversed when it comes to expressing our true feelings in these really, important, momentous moments. And ideally, we're refining these skills over a lifetime, but that's not always the case. So it takes practice to be with ourselves, and it takes practice to be with others, as Dean alluded to earlier in his example. So one exercise that I really love just to ground us and to get us more present, to aid in truth telling, is the Hawaiian practice of ho'oponopono. And loosely translated, this means to make right. In this particular context, looking at grief and pain, discomfort, death, I think this is a tool, a really practical tool, and a means of walking a full circle back into the center of our lives and looking at what matters most. It's not a magical fix, but it's a container and a practice that really can work to reestablish connection and truth. So the handout here highlights, kind of the basis of what this is. And, this practice can be applied whether someone we love is dying. It can be applied if we are the ones dying. Or, I think if done with a lot of courage, it's actually a means of doing truth telling, way upstream before the dying process. So the basics of how it works, and there's a lot more to say about this, but I'm going to kind of just give you a brief overview. Is you pull up an image of someone that you care about in your life, and at its essence, this practice can be done for multiple people. And you begin to imagine them sitting next to you or before you. And as you hold them in your vision, an emphasis is placed on your heart space, that center of your chest. And the 4 places of reflection that you move through, the things that you're really striving to communicate clearly are: I am sorry for, please forgive me for, or I forgive you for, thank you for, and I love you because. It can be really useful, the process alone is really powerful, but also to, think about writing out your responses and eventually gifting these words from the heart to people that really, have a great impact in your life. It's a really, really simple but powerful exercise. And I think it's powerful because it offers up an opportunity to walk towards the uncomfortable, to reveal, to touch upon the essentials of where we've caused hurt, where forgiveness might be needed, where we might need to extend or ask for forgiveness, and where we have, a need to express love and gratitude. And I really love it because, it bucks the notion that things are better off unsaid or unconfronted. And I think, through the simplicity of it, you are quite possibly making the unknown seen, by this simple exercise. And I think the power of doing it in this space, before we or someone else has died, is that it makes the eventual goodbye intentional. Gives us a chance to touch upon that which we might have bypassed or denied in life. It opens up a space for real vulnerability and care. And we gift ourselves the opportunity to, to be fully human, to see the grief and the joy. And it's fundamentally, it's about presence, about being present to what is and all of it. And it's us doing our part and offering up a truthful narrative that includes, really the fullness of our life, the easy to love, easy to embrace aspects of it, and also the discomfort. So I'd really encourage you just to play with this exercise in the near future. We don't, unfortunately, have enough time to kind of go through it here just because we only have the 90 minutes together, but you have the prompts in your handout. And I am now going to turn it back over to Sarah. She's going to just sort of share some insights and beautiful wisdom around how it is we might show up for the grieving process after a death or a major loss has occurred. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really, thank you. So this section, I'm really going to come from my own personal experience. My daughter was killed instantly in a car crash when my family was hit by a drunk driver at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And so the traumatic, the depth of trauma in having suffered that magnitude of loss and in that way is sort of a never-ending well of trauma and sorrow. And the people who showed up for me in the immediate, and my husband, I'll say me a lot, but the collective me, in those first few days really allowed me to continue to live. And one thing that I've heard so much since then is just this lack of understanding, like Elizabeth talked about, where people don't know what to say, and so they don't say anything. And I just want to acknowledge that there's a very big difference between not knowing what to say and choosing to say nothing. And so coming full circle, you know, that's kind of what we're hoping we can give you today, is some ideas, because saying something is meaningful. Even if you're not sure about it, hopefully we can help close some of those gaps for you. But first and foremost, following a loss, any loss, you know, in my experience, a very traumatic loss, it's important to understand your position in the loss. And maybe you guys have seen this graphic before, but I think it's a pretty spot on diagram here, that you really, as a supporter of the person in grief, need to understand where in the ring you are. What ring are you in? And then the support that you need should really come from either your ring or a ring outside you. It's very important that as you walk the path with somebody in deep grief or grief, you are aware of your own grief, right? Like Dean was saying, the total pain contributes to that of the one you're trying to support. And so here is sort of a quick snapshot visual that hopefully you can use to think like, where am I? What circle am I in? And how do I get the support I need from a circle that's outer of mine versus requiring some inner support or some support from the inner ring? You really just need to understand your position, like I said. And the primary thing to remember is that you can't fix the grief. I remember listening to Dean speak actually, and saying, he was talking about a woman who had had a miscarriage and how people are enticed by saying things like, well, you can have another child. That will never take the place of the child she lost. And so the only way to fix the grief is to bring that child back, and we can't do that. And in my own experience, most certainly the only way to fix what was going on with me was to give me my daughter back. And the harsh realization that that's impossible is the real jumping off point for providing support to somebody in grief. So these days we hear a lot of people talk about leaning in or showing up, and I just wonder sometimes if we all really understand what that means. So in my experience, showing up, one example was the night of Marley, her death. I was lying on the couch in my parents' living room, you know, as you can imagine, paralyzed, and Dean sat in the armchair next to me, and I just knew he was there. Okay, I just knew he was there. And you might say showing up or being present really isn't much of anything, you're just there. But I'll tell you that Dean showed up knowing what circle he was in the grief rings. He showed up not trying to fix what was going on with me, because he knew that he couldn't. And he was present in his own pain enough to be present in mine. And I can't express with words how meaningful that was, and how I actually have never even spoken about it until just the other day, because it was such an incredibly tender moment. And I felt, as this grieving mother, so tended to, cared for, and loved. And he said nothing. So, I mean, we could argue what I started with about saying nothing versus not knowing what to say, but there were no words for that day. And so what he did was practice what we're sharing with you. Like I said, he knew what ring he was in. He knew his own discomfort and was able to be with mine. And he showed up just to be there with me. And I'd like to pause and ask Dean to share with all of us what that was like from the other person's point of view, because I don't think that often we are given the chance to hear somebody like me talk about what it was like to be supported simultaneously with the person who was actually offering the support in such a very tender and raw moment.
Well, I mean, it was one of the hardest moments of my life. So, I mean, Sarah talks about it like, you know, I was some sort of a guru all kind of together and stuff, and that wasn't true at all. I mean, not only was the loss and their suffering horrific to the point of just physically debilitating. There was also the fact that, you know, I had grandchildren that were the same age as Marley. I mean, I had my own grief for my friends who were suffering in this way. I had my own rage at the universe that anything like this would happen. And so all of that is going on inside of me at the same time as I am trying to be present and simply present with and recognizing that there was nothing I could say or do that was going to fix it. That things I might say or do, that was going to come later, you know, but that first night, just to have the ability, I mean, first of all, the privilege for me to be able to sit with she and Jay and be a witness and be present and to recognize that there never really is my suffering and your suffering. There's only just our suffering together, and just simply hold that as the reality. So yeah, there were then many other things over the next days where, you know, there was more conversation, but not at the beginning.
Exactly. The profound gift that Dean and others gave to my family by letting us do the things we needed to do in those first hours, days, really transformed in a lot of ways the path of grief that was before us. I'll go back to the screen here. So what is showing up? It's avoiding the projection, the you shoulds. You know, things that stick out in my mind are people telling me you should eat, you should shower, you should sleep, you should not sleep, you should do it. So many you shoulds. And it felt like I was in a war zone already. And these were just like additional ammunition being fired at me with the shoulds, because what they thought I should or shouldn't be doing was basically irrelevant. For the most part, and I really actually didn't want to hear it, and it wasn't helpful, but that was their mechanism to be in the discomfort, because when we're faced with that discomfort and the lack of control, it's like clinging to things that we think we can control. You should have something to eat, you should lie down, you know. And so to really check yourself, like we've used these self-assessments earlier today, to say, where am I in this? What is showing up for me that's compelling me to give these should statements? Validation instead of the fixing, like we talked about. What does it mean to just be with? This is the collective suffering, like Dean said, and it's not about fixing it. So just any kind of validation you can offer to people, and sometimes that's your therapeutic presence, is helpful. And then the competitive grief, I've found that it's shifted over the years. It's been 3.5 years since I lost my daughter. And for a very long time, it was, oh, well, my grief is nothing compared to your grief, nothing at all. I can't even. And fair enough. I mean, I would have rather lost somebody else besides my daughter, of course, but that's just not helpful, because there's no real value in setting up this system of whose grief is worse, because the bottom line is that your grief is the worst because it's yours. I heard David Kessler say that recently, and I thought that was pretty well articulated. And that the true value is in connection. Oh, I'm grieving too. I miss her too. Okay, so finding the connection versus the competition. And I'll say that most, I mean, maybe all people who've said to me, well, my grief is nothing compared to yours, are coming from the most genuine, sympathetic place in their heart. And yet it's still not helpful, as are the people showing up with the fix-its or the shoulds or the, we're coming at this with the good intention. It's just that we have never been taught how to actually provide that support. So the way the griever hears it, it doesn't come off the same level of support that's available if, say, you were listening to more of what we're talking about here. So using bridging statements like, I miss them too versus I lost them too. I've had people say, well, I lost Marley too. And it's true. The whole world lost her and it's a tragedy. Yet they aren't setting one last plate at their dinner table. I am. And so this competitive nature is just a really bad idea from the start. And so coming up with ways to connect, I miss them too. And like Elizabeth was talking about, we want grievers to kind of move on and get back to being better. And so instead of maybe coming up with ideas for ways in which the griever can get better, what if we shared with them that we miss them? I miss you. The people who've been able to identify that that's part of the transition they're facing in relationship with me as my grief marches on, the ones who've been able to say, I miss you, it's really profound, and it actually creates an entry point for a deeper, more meaningful connection, opposed to experiences where I can tell that people are exhausted by my grief and really do just want me to get better and return to what I once was, which, as you all can imagine, is impossible. So, those are just a couple nuggets of ways in which you can show up for somebody, especially in those raw days. But I will say that especially the bridging statements, ways to find connection in the collective grief experience, like I miss them too, are long lasting throughout any grief process. And, the grief doesn't stop at year 1 or year 2, or when you have another child, or, it marches on, and I mean that. And so to even use the word healing seems like a limiting belief system, because what does it say about me if I can't heal from the death of my child? Does it say something's wrong with me? So, a lot of the language I use is around integrate. I've learned to live with. And the way that I've learned to integrate, the way that I have integrated this devastating loss into my life, is a lot in part because of the support of people who have used these tools. So one other tool is compassionate listening. And Dean is about to share with us some real skill building around how to be a compassionate listener.
Yeah, and I really want to stress that the compassionate listening part is an important part, but it is not primarily the most important part. The most important part is our presence. And so there is a slide that just talks about open presence, and you hear that a lot. And so I really want to parse it a bit. And being openly present with somebody who is suffering is to be present with no agenda. And that is that I'm not there to fix it. I'm not there to make them better. I'm not there. I'm simply there. That I'm fully there in not only my mind, in my thinking part, but I'm emotionally present and there for them. And I'm there in my body physically, and have placed myself in a place that's open and curious. as I say, out of fix-it mentality and in what we might call beginner's mind, which means I don't really know. I don't really know what's needed here. There is no plan. What is appropriate will arise spontaneously in the moment, and to be trusting of that, to be unattached to any particular outcome or how it should look, and then to be able to do what I've called compassionate listening. A friend of mine who's a hospice chaplain just simply said, the way he tells himself how he shows up with every individual patient he just says, how I arrive makes all the difference. So compassionate listening, and if we go on just a couple of slides, I think it's important to, first of all, to understand that there are many, many ways in our world, which is mainly about transmit, where we simply do not listen to one another. We often listen with an agenda or an intention to respond. Oftentimes you'll notice that you'll be telling some story about something that's important to you, and as you're speaking, the person who you're speaking to begins to raise their finger because they've got a response, and they've been thinking about their response and not really listening to you, so that you talk faster and faster and faster so that you can get what you need to say in before you run out of breath, because if you take a breath, they will start to talk. Denying or invalidating a person's experience, and I think that Sarah did a great job of just talking about how easy it is for us to simply, because of our own discomfort with what's going on, to simply say, oh, don't feel that way, or you shouldn't be this sad this long after what happened, or whatever, is to not fully receive and not be fully present with another. Interrupting. If you begin to notice every time you get together with a group of your friends how often people are interrupted, you'll be amazed. It happens all the time. Someone will be deep into some story that they're telling, and someone will interrupt them. And the natural tendency of all of us then is to follow the conversation, which means we turn our eyes to the person who just interrupted, who started to speak. If you spend just a moment continuing to look at the person who was speaking, who was interrupted, every time it happens, you'll watch a small death occur. My Life Story, chapter 43. This is another way of listening with the intention to respond, but it's responding with the, the same, isn't it interesting? The same thing happened to me back in 1965 and then often running is the person you've been telling a story to of something that's important to you, and they're off in their life story, chapter 43, same thing happened to me. Sometimes in our quest to understand, at least on our intellectual level, we'll ask unending questions. So I might want to tell a story about my oldest grandson, who my son-in-law and I enjoy playing disc golf. We're not like passionate out there playing disc golf every second of our lives, but we do enjoy getting together and playing around a disc golf, and even have some hoops in his yard. And so whenever we go over for dinner, we'll do a little round of disc golf. And Peterson has been playing disc golf with us forever, and he's now 7. And I might be telling the story about how, when he was little, we'd carry him around the course, and then he got to the point where he'd just throw his disc into the basket when we stood there. And now he's gotten to the point where he can actually fling that disc a little ways. And I might be telling that story to someone, and they'd say, Tilson, he's your oldest grandson, right? Yeah, he is. And then I'd tell a little, and he's Marissa's son, right? Yeah, he is. And I wanted to tell you a little bit. And he goes to which school? And pretty soon I'm like, I'm done telling that story. no longer interested. It's like, that's not the point of my story. And the last part is the listening with the intention or to fix or solve the problem. One of my personal favorite ways to listen to my wife, Marla's, you know, she'll come home with some issue that she's had and want to be telling me the story of a glitch or a relationship hiccup or something like that. And honestly, within a few minutes of her telling the story, I have a plan about how she should do this and this and this in order to fix this problem that she's having. And every time I launch into one of those things, I get that look, which means that she is perfectly capable of solving this problem herself. She simply wanted me to hear and to know what is going on with her in her life. And oftentimes we get so uncomfortable in our own discomfort with what it is that someone might be sharing, especially in a situation of grief and suffering, that our move to try to fix things, to try to make it better in order for us to feel better, comes out as saying something truly stupid. And so, as Sarah said, the woman who has a miscarriage and the well-meaning person who says, well, at least you know you can get pregnant and you can have another one, as if that fixes the one that never will be. As if that takes away the grief of the one that is lost. It's just not fixable, and you have to just recognize it's not fixable. If you're asked for advice about fixing an air conditioning unit, it's perfectly fine to respond with a fix-it kind of a conversation. So how might we listen? We might listen not with the intention to respond, but with but formulating a true intention to understand deeply, what does this story, what does this situation, what does this suffering, what does this grief mean to this person? Because it has different meaning for everybody. And to come in and contact the person's experience in order to get a better view of what's going on without just contacting information. And we listen with all three centers of our body, with our mind, our heart, and our body. So the mind listening, next slide, the mind listening, we do that automatically. So we don't really need to think about that. We're great at parsing the information content of someone's story. What we really need to be able to start to practice doing when listening is to be able to understand what emotions are evoked in me when I'm listening to your story. What's my empathetic response? And how might I imagine this story is impacting you? And in addition to an emotions like glad, sad, mad, afraid, you know, the kind of the fundamental four basic, to look for what's going on in my body and my gut. Sensations. Do I feel hot? Do I feel cold? Sometimes, you know, someone will tell you a story and all little hairs on your arm will just stand up. That's a body sensation. Or tears will come to your eyes, not because you're sad, but because you're so deeply touched. Or your throat will get tight. Or sometimes you want to just stand up and run. Your body, you know, all of those things are signs about what's going on in this conversation, and they're signs to pay attention to when you're truly fully receiving the other person. So you bring yourself, next slide, centered, present, and grounded. You demonstrate that with your body position and with eye contact. So, you know, you don't turn around, you don't go onto your iPhone, you're not looking over the person's shoulder at something else going on in the room. You're not in your head writing your grocery list, but you're present with this person. And you listen for the content, the emotions, and the sensations as you experience them, or how you think it might mean for them. The important part is not the content. And occasionally you might come in and suggest an emotion or a sensation that the person might be feeling. So if I were telling you the story of Peterson playing disc golf, and I were to tell you that, you know, we used to carry him around the entire course, both my son-in-law and I would carry him most of the way. He'd, you know, take a disc and throw it into the basket when we got there, and we'd praise him for it. And then after a while, he would start to throw the disc from the takeoff place and go out about 4 feet, and we'd pick it up and carry it to the thing as we played, and then he'd throw it in. And now he's doing something more. Well, as I'm telling that story to someone who really has the intention to understand, they might come in at some point, as I was talking about how he throws the disc and it goes out there and he's really pretty accurate now. And you might say something like, sounds like you're proud of him. And I might say, I am proud of him. So I sink into a better understanding of my own story, and I feel as though you've truly heard me. Or I might say, I am proud of him, but I'm also touched about how proud he is of himself. So not only there did I get to acknowledge one part of the story, which I might have really not understood, but a secondary part of the story of my own story that I've just realized in telling the story and having you contact my experience is I realize I'm also noticing his own pride in his own ability to learn and grow in something physical, and that he and it's something he enjoys doing with his dad and his grandpa. So in doing that, even if you're not exactly right in what it is that that you touch into the emotion, it might be that I tear up a little when I'm telling the story, and they might look at me and say, "Are you feeling sad?" And then I might say, "No, I don't feel sad at all. I just feel really touched, and I just love him so much." It's okay that you get it wrong. It's not a problem. What's essential is that I feel accompanied rather than just listened to. I feel as though you are sharing the experience with me. In all the years that Annalisa underwent her surgeries, and all of the physicians and nurses and people she had contact with over 34 years, not a single person ever asked her, "What does this illness mean to you?" and listen to some sort of response. And yet her major suffering in all those years was around the stories she told herself about her own illness. And, you know, the pain of a surgery or the pain of the headache, that comes and goes. That wasn't the deepest suffering. So for someone to truly receive her story, for someone to look at her and say, "No, I wasn't going to do anything. I just wanted to hold your hand and get to know you," made all the difference in the world for her. So Douglas Steer says on the next slide, to listen another's soul into a condition of disclosure and discovery may be the greatest service that any human being ever performs for another. And so my hope would be that this is a technique or a way of listening in which you are which can support your presence, and it's your presence that's really the primary gift for anyone who's suffering. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean. So once you've practiced being present and silent and knowing where you were in the ring and being willing to not fix it, and then you've shown up and you've used your new compassionate listening skills to provide comfort and validation, I'm interested to see how people respond to this new idea that we consider grief as having several types of languages. So in the spirit of time, I'll just use the analogy of like an Enneagram number or a horoscope or something that you would use to describe the filter through which you see the world. And that's how I'd like to describe ways to show up specifically in grief to people, hope to and try to identify what their specific filter might be, and then some suggestions for connecting with them in that. So this actually came to be because my husband and I were sitting on our front steps a while back, and he shared with me that it was hard for him that I didn't spend a lot of time talking about memories of our daughter. And I noticed that I had felt the same way, except for I wished he could spend more time imagining her these days. Who would her friends be? What would her hair look like? How would she like school? And he and I both said, I just can't do that. That's not the language I'm speaking right now. And I started to really consider what other languages might show up. And so here's just my first try at it. And, memories. Are you or the griever in your life using memories to integrate your grief? A good assessment. How do memories make you feel? For me, memories take my breath away, and I can get goosebumps right now on the back of my neck just thinking about it. It's very hard for me. Finding connection and memories in sharing them. And I wonder if the people in my husband's life had this ticket of information that is how they can support him in grief. So many people are afraid to bring up memories because it might remind us of our loss, but you probably all heard, like, you're not going to remind us, we are thinking about it all the time anyway. And then, like with Dean's conversation around compassionate listening, using thoughtful questions to elicit more memory talk, being specific, being intentional, and asking for more information about the memories, providing that connection. Imagining, are you or the griever in your life comforted in grief through the wonder of what would be? How does imagining make you feel? So again, I'm getting the goosebumps on my neck because I live right by a school. And so I get to watch all the kids that would be with her in first grade march on to school. And I think about what her best friend would be saying to her. And for me, that is a way of continuing to integrate the grief into my life today. You find the connection in imagining with the griever, not being afraid, asking those intentional questions. And you can use imagery to allow for more imagining, dreaming. You can use art, meditation. There's a lot of ways to tap into that imagination. Of course, the afterlife, are you or the griever comforted in your belief in an afterlife or heaven? Ways to identify if this is the language of grief that either you or someone you're supporting is speaking is whether or not they're talking about it. Obviously, has eternal life been a common thread in the conversation? Do you find yourself or hear yourself saying, they're in a better place? This is where the religious ritual also has a part in offering that connection, using prayer, ritual, and religious faith traditions to connect and find that meaning with the person or for yourself. Additionally, all of these are also ways for us as grievers to ask for what we need in a accessible way. So as much as a supporter might say, I don't know what to say, you can imagine, or maybe you are experiencing that as a griever, it is also difficult to articulate what it is you need because it feels like a black hole sometimes. And so as much as these are filters through which you might assess somebody else or understand yourself, also use that information to ask for what you need and teach people how to be with you in your grief. Physical, are you or the griever struggling to be still? Does physical exercise provide a sense of calm and meditation? For me, in some dark days, I did a lot of hard, hot, fast yoga. It was one of the only ways I could really disconnect from my story, be present in the moment. So, it's an effective tool, and you can offer support through movement, going for walks. And sometimes that honestly looks like somebody's talking on the phone while somebody is walking. It's just being there in what they need through their filter and their grief language. Contemplation, are you or the griever comforted by silence and contemplation? How does the griever respond to stimulus? It's a really important question. We have a tendency to shower the griever, especially at the beginning. And it's just good to know that there might be another way, that quiet, stillness, and contemplation also might provide support. Does this activity and engagement offer chaos or comfort? And you offer connection through exactly what we talked about today, especially when I shared the story about Dean and sitting next to me, that level of intimate, quiet participation in somebody's grief process. Supernatural, are you or the griever comforted in signs sent by the deceased? What is the sign you or your griever has identified as meaningful? And you can offer support and connection or ask for what you need by sharing in the belief. Okay, when somebody tells me that they find dimes because, you know, their son passed away and now they find dimes everywhere they go, the last thing you want to do is contradict that in any way, because it doesn't matter. It's meaning making, and that's the point. How do we make meaning from these things? So you can also share signs like feathers everywhere. And when I get multiple messages weekly that share with me that they found a feather, what does that say? That says they too are thinking about my daughter. What more could a mother want than that, right? That's my quick view of the new languages of grief and how we might not only assess the filter through which we're grieving, but how we can offer support, ask for support, or show up for people in any way with a more dialed in and intentional language. And I think I'd love to close today with this poem. You know, it's going to talk about a boulder, and I just want us to think about boulders can be as small as what it takes to gather the energy to take a shower amidst your grief, all the way to the big story of the anger and the unjustness that is so common in grief. Atlas is always shouldering his load. You know the feeling, the weight of everything pressing in, suffocating. And there is Sisyphus, pushing the boulder uphill over and over, two poster boys for ceaseless effort. But what if, now here's a radical idea, the way of transformation is not a long or tortured change? What if it's just being here, this moment, now, complete and whole? What if you could whisper in Atlas's big ear, it's time to let go, really, the heavens will not disappear if you put your burden down. Imagine him thinking about it. Imagine him believing. See him set the load down, straighten up, stretch, smile, stride over to Sisyphus and say something you can't hear. See the stone roll down and Sisyphus choose not to follow. You are the witness to the shouts of joy, the head shaking, wonder and relief. You mean it's that easy? Imagine the spring in their step, the lightness of their laughter as they climb that hill and disappear from view. So it's not about setting your grief down. It's about looking at elements of your discomfort that you can set aside and watch the boulder go down the hill as you choose to not let that be a burden. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah and Dean, for sharing this space with all of us today. You know, to sit, the imagery that, you know, is so important is to hold the circle, that we're sitting in circle and witnessing all of our collective experiences, the heartache and the pain and the discomfort that we all, in so many ways, personal ways and collective ways, encounter on a daily basis. So we just really respect and honor and bow down to the courage that it takes to show up to these conversations, to these topics that the majority of the world around us, you know, tends to turn the back on. So we really, really, really value and hold up your courage. We have shared in the side chat box here, we have a link to the slideshow for those that were not, we did send it ahead of time, but I'm sorry, some people seem to not have gotten it. So you can download it on the site if you would like that. And we intend to follow up with an email to everyone with some of the links and things that we've mentioned during the offering as well. There also is on the side here links to both Clear Mourning, Sarah's organization, and to the Peaceful Presence Project, the organization that I work with, and also the Sacred Art of Living Center, which Dean mentioned at the beginning. So again, we really honor your time. We're right here at the 5:30 mark, and we wish you all a beautiful and heartfelt evening. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, really.
Deep gratitude to each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Precious.
Thank you.
Thank you for your vulnerability.
Thank you.